In this third episode of the Houses of Life series, I will explain how to do basic planetary assessment. In other words, to evaluate the quality of the planets in a birth chart. I'm offering a new report called the Houses of Life. And this report evaluates and explains each of your 12 houses and each subtopic of each house. So let's talk a bit and let me share some of the techniques and systems that drive this unique report. So let's begin with an overview of what's involved in this assessment of the planets. You will want to know 5 things in order to assess the planets. The first thing is the dignity. The second thing is how the planet's being influenced by other planets. The third thing is how tightly the planet is aligned to the cusp of the house that it occupies. And then the fourth thing that you would need to know about planets is how close it is to the border of its sign. This is called the Bhav Sandhi. And finally, you want to know how close it is to the sun, and this is called combustion. So as for dignity, we already explained how you quantify that. We did that in episode 2. So go back and look at episode 2 if you haven't already, so that you know how you quantify a planet's dignity. In episode 3, this video, I'll show you these next 4 things. Let's start with the combined influences. And of course, Marilyn Monroe is going to help us again by being the example chart. So for combined influences, to figure out the combined influences, basically all you're doing is you're taking the amount of aspect and conjunction that a planet receives. So if you look at the table that just popped up, you can say, if you want to assess the sun, then you'll just say, well, it's got 57 points of aspect from the moon, 75 from Mars, 88 from Mercury, 87 from Jupiter, and you would just tally those up, and you would get a combination of all the influences on the sun. That's one way to do it, but that's overly simplified. We're going to do a few more steps. The first of those steps is that we're going to scale the influence by the dignity of the influencer. And then the next step that we're going to do is we're going to classify the influence as either positive or negative. And we're going to do that based on whether or not the influencer is a functional benefic or functional malefic. And if you're not familiar with that, then go to episode 1 of this series. Planets can also be functionally neutral. As in Monroe's case, Mercury is functionally neutral for Leo ascendant. So in that case, you classify Mercury's influence according to whether or not its dignity is positive or negative. I'll show you examples of all of these. In fact, right now, let's do it. Here's an example of a functional benefic. Jupiter is a functional benefic for the Leo ascendant. The reason is that it has a Mula Tricone sign on the 5th house. It owns the 5th house. So since it's a functional benefic, its influence is going to be benefic or positive. It has an 87% aspect on the sun. And it has 40% dignity because it's in the house of a friend. So what you do is you say 87% is the basis of how Jupiter is going to influence the sun. And then you take a scale of that by dignity, which means you take 87 times 0.4. You take 40% of 87 and then add it to 87. So you'll get 121.8 positive influence from Jupiter to the sun. That's how you quantify these astrological theories, which is very important, because without quantifying them, you don't really know them in detail, and you can't really use them very systematically. I will now show you an example for neutral, functionally neutral planet, which is Mercury in this case. Monroe's Mercury has an 88%, it's not an aspect actually, but it's influence. It's a conjunction to the sun that's got 88% intensity. And it has 80% positive dignity because it's in its own sign. So because it has positive dignity and is functionally neutral, the effect, the influence that it has is positive. The amount is 88 plus 80% of 88. So it comes up to be 158.4 positive influence on the sun from Mercury. One more example from a functional malefic, Saturn. Since it's a functional malefic, it's going to be a negative influence. Saturn influences the sun by 83%. And it is a negative 70% dignity because it's in a very inimical relationship with its host, Mars. So the way you calculate Saturn's influence on the sun is you take the basis 83% and then you take 70% of 83 and add it to 83. You get 141.1, and then you make the whole thing negative because it's a functional malefic. So if you do that for every planet, to every planet, so for example, you do the moon's effect to the sun, Mars effect to the sun, Mercury effect to the sun, Jupiter effect to the sun, Venus effect to the sun, Saturn effect to the sun, and then tally it up for the sun. Then do the same thing for the moon. Then do the same thing for Mars, etc. Then you'll get a complete table of the combined influences to each planet. And yes, you have to do that. And yes, this is why astrologers used to have 3 or 4 or 5 assistants. And these days, this is why astrologers like to use software. Because you don't want to spend hours and hours doing this just to read a person's birth chart. So now we've covered the combined influences, and let's look at the next part of planetary assessment, which is how tightly the planet aligns to the cusp. Basically, to quantify the alignment to the cusp, you just take the amount of conjunction that the planet has with its house. So, for example, Saturn has a value of 72 because Saturn is in the 4th house and it's at 21 degrees and the 4th house cusp is at 13 degrees. I also explained this in more detail in episode 2. And so there's only 8 degrees separating them, and that works out to be 72% of conjunction. I'll give you examples for all the planets. Jupiter is in the 7th house, so you go and you find Jupiter's amount of conjunction to the 7th house cusp. It's 30%. You could see them circled on the table. Mars in the 8th house, 92%. Venus in the 9th house, not so close, right? It's the 9th house cusp is 13 degrees and Venus is at 29. That's not so close. It's only a 54% conjunction. Mercury in the 11th house, that's 7 degrees with the cusp at 13. So it's pretty close, but it has the sun in between it. So the sun is taking away most of its conjunction to the cusp. So Mercury's conjunction to the cusp of the 11th house only amounts to 39%. Moon is doing the opposite of that. Moon is taking Jupiter's power because the moon is closer to the 7th house cusp than Jupiter, so it's taking some of Jupiter's alignment. So it gets actually over 100%, but we'll cap it at 100%. Again, if you want to review that in a little slower pace and more detail, look at episode 2, the video before this one in the series. And finally, the sun has the same situation. It's the one that's taking the conjunctive power from Mercury on the 11th house, so it gets over 100%. It gets 131, but we'll cap it at 100. So now, in these yellow numbers, we have the basis of the value of how a planet aligns to a cusp. We're going to use these yellow numbers in 3 ways. We may just use them straight, the way they are, or we may modify them, depending on what type of house the planet is in. So if the planet is in a prominent house, which is the 1st house, the 4th house, the 5th house, the 9th house, or the 10th house. Why those houses? Those are the trines or the angles, Kendras and Konas, with the exception of the 7th house, because the 7th house is a sunset, so it's not going to be considered prominent. It has the element of diminishing because it's the west and the sunset, so it doesn't get counted as a prominent house, but it's a Kendra, so it doesn't get counted as a diminishing house. So if the planet is in 1, 4, 5, 9, or 10, then the bonus that it gets by conjoining its cusp is more than 100. It's 150. So in other words, it's more powerful to be aligned with the house cusp of a prominent house than of a normal house. And I'll show you an example of that. Before that, I just want to explain this rule. the hidden houses. Hidden houses are linastan. They're called the 3rd, 6th, 8th, and 12th. If you are in this house, then you want to be out of alignment with the cusp. The more you're in alignment with the cusp in one of these houses, the more hidden you become. So we will consider a negative 100%. And the exception is if you're the lord of the 6th, 8th, or 12th in any one of these houses, it's positive. Or if you're the third lord in the third house, it's positive. Let me try to show you some examples of this rule in action in Marilyn Monroe's chart. Here in this yellow post-it, I'm showing you the 3 planets in her chart which are not simple. Venus and Saturn are in prominent houses. Venus is in the 9th and Saturn is in the 4th. And Mars is in the 8th, so it's in a hiding house. So the rest of the planets, they're in regular houses, so you'll just take their straight value. For example, Jupiter and the Moon, they're just in a regular house, so they have, Jupiter has 30% of 100, in other words 30%. The Moon has 100% of 100, so it has 100. But these 3 planets that are in the post-it, they're special cases because they're either in a prominent house or a hidden house. So for Venus and Saturn, they're in prominent houses. So instead of, for example, for Venus, instead of 54% of 100, it's 54% of 150. And the same is true for Saturn. It's 72% of 150. And Mars is 100%, but negative 100%. So it works out to negative 92. Okay. Now we've gone over the combined influences and the alignment to the cusp. Let's now explain how you figure the closeness to the border of a sign. How do you quantify the bhavsandhi? The principle behind the bhavsandhi concept or the sign border concept is if you have to traverse or travel from one place to another, then doing so occupies all your attention. So when a planet is in a sign border, its attention gets occupied by that border and it becomes less capable of doing whatever else it was supposed to do. So the way to quantify this is to put a 4-degree zone near the border where a planet will feel the effect of being close to the border. If a planet is more than 4 degrees away from the border, it's not going to be affected by this rule at all. So in Marilyn Monroe's case, we only have Jupiter and Venus being within 4 degrees of their border. Jupiter's at 27 degrees Aquarius. That's 3 degrees from the border. And Venus is at 29 degrees Aries. That's 1 degree from the border. So only these 2 planets will be affected by Sandhi. The rest of the planets will have no effect from this. Now, how do we quantify the effect on Jupiter and Venus? It's quite simple. We'll just do a ratio. If a planet is 0 degrees away from the border, then it's going to have a full effect from this principle of Sandhi. And if it's at 4 degrees away, we'll have 0 effect. And just a ratio for any place in between. So for example, Jupiter's 3 degrees away. You just take 3 and divide it by 4. And you get 0.75. And then you subtract that from 1 to get the penalty. The amount of penalty that Jupiter suffers from being 3 degrees away from the border is 25% of what it could possibly suffer. Whereas with Venus, it'll be the opposite. It's 1 degree away from the border, so 1 divided by 4 is 0.25. And 0.25 subtracted from 1 is 0.75, so Venus has a 75% penalty. I'll show you what we're going to do with this at the end. At the end, we're going to put all these things together. It's like when you make a recipe that's complex and you have to make several things first before you make the main recipe. That's what's going on here. First, we have to calculate the amount of influence on the planet. Then we have to calculate the alignment to the cusp. That's a separate little dish. And then we have to calculate the closeness to the border. And finally, we also need to look at this final part of the recipe, which is how close the planet is to the sun, which means how combust it is. So here's how combustion works. If you get close to the sun is very bright and we won't be able to see you. We'll only see the sun. And so when you become invisible from the sky, that signifies you're losing your potence. You're losing your importance. And it also signifies the sun is swallowing you. So the sun will gain the prominence from a planet that comes too close to it, and that planet itself will lose it or give it to the sun. That's the concept behind combustion. And now let me explain the way to calculate it. It's basically exactly the same as calculating the closeness to the border, except that there's not a fixed distance. Like with the border, it was a fixed distance of 4 degrees. With closeness to the sun, it's different for each planet because each planet has a different amount of brightness. And so it survives closer into the sun before it becomes invisible, depending on how bright it is. If you look quickly at Marilyn Monroe's chart, you'll see there's only one planet that's close to the sun. It's Mercury. So all you have to do is figure out how close. Sun is at 10 degrees, Mercury is at 7. 10 minus 7 is 3, right? 3 is less than 12. Mercury's tolerance to the sun is 12 degrees. More than 12 degrees, you can see it. Less than 12 degrees, you can't. So we're just going to have to get a ratio of 3 to 12. And that's how we're going to quantify the amount of combustion that Mercury is suffering. And so you divide 3 by 12, you get 0.25. And then you subtract that from 1 to get 0.75. So Mercury is 75% combust. So it will lose 75% of its potency to the sun. And the sun will gain that 75% potency from Mercury. And now the moment you've been waiting for. How do you put all of these ingredients together to figure out the basic condition of each planet? Well, before I explain that, just for 2 seconds, if you look carefully at the table that's on screen right now, you'll see that the values here for combustion and Sunday are slightly different than what we just calculated. Here it says the sun has 69 positive for combustion and Mercury is 69 negative, but we just said that it should be 75. The reason is simple. In these examples that I've been showing you, I just rounded off all the minutes and the seconds. But in the actual software that I created for this Houses of Life report, I don't round off minutes or seconds. I use the minutes and seconds. And that's why the numbers are slightly different. Now, to tally everything up, it starts very simple. You just take the average of these first 3 principles. You take the average of dignity, influences, and alignment. Then you modify that average by the Sunday and the combustion. So now I'll explain that by example, showing you 3 planets from Marilyn Monroe's chart: Sun, Mercury, and Venus. So you see the Sun's dignity is minus 40, the combined influence to it is 228, and its cusp alignment is 100. If you average those 3 numbers together, you get positive 96. The Sun has no Sunday effect, and it's gaining 69% by combustion of Mercury. So you take 96 and you multiply it by 1.69 to get the final amount of strength for the sun. In Marilyn Monroe's chart, it's 162%. It's pretty phenomenal. It's important that that's her first lord. And for Mercury, you do the same. 80 is the dignity, 105 combined influence, 39 alignment to the cusp. The average of that is 75. It's going to lose most of it to its combustion. 69% combustion negative means that you multiply it by 0.31 to get 23. So what's actually happening in Monroe's case is the first lord, sun, is in the 11th house, consuming the 11th lord. So the first lord is completely being energized by 11th house, both the house itself and the 11th lord. And that is really important for understanding this chart, the chart of a constant entertainer and pleasure giver, and that her whole life is about how enjoyable she is. And finally, I'll show you the example of Venus. If you average 40 for dignity, negative 26 for combined influence, and 81% for cusp alignment, you get a base score for Venus of 32. It has no combustion, but it has Bhava Sandhi. So the Bhava Sandhi for Venus is 69%. So that's going to be give us a multiplier of the inverse of 69%, which is 31. So 32 times 0.31 is 10. So Venus's final score is 10. Now, once we have this information, we can use it in part of a bigger recipe for figuring out how each house is doing. So stay tuned for the further episodes in this series where I'll explain how to use this number as well as the numbers from episode 2 and new stuff that I'll teach you coming up to get a combined, complete picture of all the houses in a chart. Thank you very much. I hope this helped you better understand at least one of the techniques and systems that's involved in this great new report of mine, the Houses of Life. If you want to see how these things come together for you, then go to vicdecara.com/H and order your own report today. Thanks very much.